This is Red Alert with another face-off segment. On tonight's episode, we have Frank Mylar, Rachel Terry, Attorney General, the only two candidates to come out of the state convention. This is gonna be an amazing one. Take a seat. For this next segment, what we're gonna do is, Rachel, Frank, we're gonna have you take a look at each other for the next 15 seconds. Go ahead, take a look at each other. And here we have it, face off. Let's begin. Do you guys want to flip a coin? Who would want to go first? Who would want to go last?
Rock, paper, scissors. It's the only way.
It's fine.
Okay, this is what we can do.
Okay.
We'll have Frank go first with the first portion, and on the second portion, we'll flip it to where Rachel answers first.
That's
sounds
fine.
great.
Okay.
That sounds great.
Let's start with the first question here. This one's from Sam in Provo.
Okay.
A critical role of the AG is to protect Utah and to protect fundamental freedoms for our state's residents. Do you believe that the AG can seek added protections by invoking the provisions of Utah constitutions rather than the federal constitution? Yes or no?
I'm not exactly sure on the question, but are they saying that, is the question that the Utah Constitution provides more protection than the federal? If that's what they're saying, these issues have been litigated many times, and sometimes it's yes, and sometimes it's no. An example of it being no is the Due Process Clause. Several courts have interpreted the 14th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution to be basically exactly the same as the Due Process Clause of the state Constitution. There's more questions sometimes with religious freedom. Sometimes people have brought up issues regarding cruel and unusual punishment just because there's additional clauses like unnecessary rigors. However, I've litigated personally many of those cases, especially the precedent-setting ones here in Utah. And most of them have said that they basically adopted federal law. Not once have I seen them not adopt federal law regarding unnecessary rigors or cruel and unusual punishment. And so as a practical matter, I think you have religious freedom. There's a couple other areas, I'm sure, matters of conscience, excuse me, but for the most part, it's up to the litigants to say this clause under the Utah Constitution is different, and if they don't do a good enough showing, they say, nope, we're not gonna see that it's different. That's what the courts, that's how they've interpreted it.
Okay, Rachel?
So Frank's right about in these constitutional cases, most often the litigants, the plaintiffs in these cases, they talk about the federal constitution, and then the throw-in additional claim is under the state constitution. So we don't actually have a lot of law that's interpreting the state constitution. But we've heard from our Supreme Court justices, our Utah Supreme Court justices, that they're interested in interpreting the state constitution to see if it extends and expands beyond what is allowed under the federal constitution. And that's something that I'm willing and interested to look at and to consider, because they are different. They have different words. There's a lot of overlap, but there's just not enough cases that really give us a clear view of what the state constitution does.
Okay. This next question is from Frank in Farmington. Utah is set to execute the first death row inmate since 2010. What is the role of the AG in this process? We'll start with you, Frank.
I'm sure. When the Taylor execution happened in 1996, I was the attorney over the Department of Corrections, and I was actually the representative for the Attorney General during that execution. So it was also a firing squad. And so I actually observed it. If there had been any last-minute writ from a U.S. Supreme Court or Utah Court of Appeals or 10th Circuit Court of Appeals, I would have been there to actually deal with that immediately. And what was the other part of the question? Just what would we do?
What's your role in the process?
Oh, the role.
Yeah.
So the role is that the AG can be there personally. I don't know if any Attorney General has ever been there personally, but I know that I was there, the appointee of the Attorney General, representing the state of Utah in the Attorney General's office during that last execution. So the purpose of my being there, was if there was any constitutional question whatsoever that arose. And so I actually needed to know how they were going to execute, and I actually learned exactly how they were going to do it, and it was flawless. The person died instantaneously. There was 6 30-30 rifles, and 7 were loaded, but one was giving a very, very strong load to feel like it was a legitimate load. And the idea was that no one actually knew who was actually firing a round that actually executed the inmate. And so all those procedures that are relevant and any legal issues that might be that might lurk at the last second, that's the role of the Attorney General, to be able to witness that and make sure everything goes off smoothly.
Rachel?
So I think this really dovetails with the question that I get on the campaign trail all the time, which is, what exactly is the role of the Attorney General? And it can also be confusing what the Attorney General's role is specifically to criminal cases, because actually most criminal cases you think of, homicides, drugs, violence, domestic violence, sexual assault, aren't handled, at least at the trial level, by the Attorney General's office. Those are most often handled by your district attorney and investigated by either a sheriff or your municipal law enforcement officers. And so what happens after they're prosecuted at the trial level, any appeals of those criminal cases then go to the Attorney General's office. And especially when we're talking about death penalty cases, most counties, most cities cities don't prosecute those. Most counties don't have the resources to handle a death penalty case because they require so many more steps, so much more process, that the Attorney General's office supports that prosecution all along the way. Then they handle the appeal, because when we're talking about a death penalty case, we're talking about a lot of appellate rights, lots of procedural rights. And then so all along the way, the Attorney General's office supports that appeal. They support the trial court work. And then, of course, when we get to the point where there's going to be an actual execution, that is supported by the attorneys of the Attorney General's office. And so it may be helpful for you to know that there's 550 employees of the Attorney General's office, 300 are attorneys, and then about a third of them work specifically on criminal cases.
Awesome. Frank, what makes you the best option on the ballot for Attorney General?
Absolutely. First of all, there's 3 major areas of the office, and Rachel just mentioned one, the criminal area. The second area is defending the state against lawsuits. The third area, which isn't talked about very much, is actually agency counsel. And that actually may include things like taking somebody's professional licensing away from Department of Professional Licensing. There's a lot of things. It could be Department of Air Quality, Department of Health, Human Services, and so on. And so the thing that's different about me is there's a couple of things that are different. One, I'm the only one that's actually criminally prosecuted defendants. I had my first felony fraud trial less than 2 years at a law school in the AG's office. I'm also the only candidate that's actually worked in every major area of the Attorney General's office. And although it's excellent that Rachel has worked in the litigation division, in the civil rights section, I worked there also. I also did school suits, Title IX, Title VI, equal protection, dealing with schools, but I also did a variety of other suits. But then I also worked in numerous areas of the office. And some of them were actually special projects as denominated by the Chief Deputy Attorney General directly. And so there's just a wealth more of information and experience that I have over 36 years of practicing law, and I've also have my own law firm for the last 24 years. The other thing that I think is important, that's my experience, but I'm really the in the trenches guy here, because when it talks about fighting pro-life issues, I've filed briefs to support pro-life. I've fought to defend sidewalk counselors who were criminally prosecuted in Salt Lake City on sidewalks. You name the issue, you name the constitutional issue, and I have most likely fought it. Asset forfeiture issues, government taking issues of property, religious freedom, religious and racial discrimination suits, suits in the employment context, in the university context. I've sued the state. I'm the only one that's actually sued the state, and I've sued the cities when they've violated people's constitutional rights. And I think it's important to have an attorney general that's not just someone that's defended the state, the status quo, but somebody that's actually had on-the-ground experience fighting for people's rights and winning, because I've won a lot of these suits.
Rachel, what makes you the best candidate on the ballot for Attorney General?
Thank you for this question. It's one of my favorite questions because I think I'm uniquely qualified for this position. And I've been so fortunate to have a really broad career. And each of those touch points in my career prepared me to serve as your Attorney General. So the first is I started in private practice. I spent 8 years at a law firm working on things ranging from mining work to financial to representing small businesses. Then I spent 2 years working for the Board of Education, and one of my jobs there was prosecuting educator misconduct. If teachers did something bad, I would prosecute them to take away their license. Then I worked for the Attorney General's office for 7 years in the civil rights litigation, handling some of the most significant cases in our state's history. I spent a year supporting and advocating for cities across the state, and now I'm the director of a state agency where I oversee a team of professionals and attorneys whose sole responsibility is protecting the state of Utah. The experience I have right now is most relevant to being the Attorney General because the Attorney General is supposed to be the leader over the attorneys and set the direction for the office. In addition, the Attorney General does budgeting and management and policy and legislation, all the things that I'm doing right now in my role. Every day, in fact, just today, I was on the phone with a bunch of attorneys trying to navigate a really complicated legal issue and figure out how to proceed and what kind of precedent we wanted to set. Today, also, I was working on a massive $1 billion restructure of the state's insurance program, and we were able to make changes in order to save tens of millions of dollars for the state. These are the kinds of things that your Attorney General can and should be able to do. And so I'm ready to hit the ground running, and I'm so proud to say that I have the support of law enforcement. Not only have I been endorsed by sheriffs across the state, but the Fraternal Order of Police, which represents thousands of law enforcement officers, the people who are on the front lines, have endorsed me. Everyone was interviewed and they endorsed me. And I'm honored that they would trust me to fight with them. And this is the kind of work that I want to do. And one last thing to add is I love this work. Like, this is the work that I've been doing for the last decade of my career. This is the work I want to keep doing. And I love advocating for Utahns, and I want to keep doing it.
I want to just comment a little bit, if I can do a little bit of a rebuttal on that.
Go ahead, Frank.
First of all, I think it's important to know that when Rachel uses the word prosecution, that's an administrative position. It's an administrative job. It's not prosecuting like criminally. And I think people hear that word prosecute and they think that you're actually filing something in the courts and filing and having trials and things in the courts. That she has not done that, but of course neither has the other competitor. The other thing I think that's important is I'm the only one in this race who's actually managed trial attorneys. I managed them in the AG's office as a section chief. I also managed them when I was director of legal affairs for the Utah Department of Corrections, where I was over a variety of investigators and also actual attorneys in that office as well. I also had the unique designation as Special Assistant Attorney General. Under that attorney, that had to be granted by the Attorney General herself, actually to allow me to do that. And so in terms of actually managing attorneys, I'm the only one that's managed attorneys that are actually litigating cases. Because when you're in risk management, that's an important role, but it's essentially an insurance function. It's a self-insurance function of the state. And so that's what that is. You're not actually managing attorneys because you're not over them. The AG's office is over the attorneys that actually defend the state of Utah. And then there's supervisors over them. And what I'm saying is I'm the only one that's been one of those supervisors over attorneys in the Attorney General's office, but also outside the Attorney General's office, and also including in my own law firm, I supervise attorneys and supervise attorneys even from other firms when we join together in joint litigation. So I think that is important. But one of the things that I neglected to say that I also want to say is the reason I'm really running is because I have a passion for fighting for people's constitutional rights. I know I can do that a lot better if I'm the Attorney General, because that's what I've already been doing for the last 24 years in my private practice. Thank you.
Rachel, what's your response to Frank?
Yeah, let me say that because of the types of cases that I've worked on, these are a $1 billion trade secret case, highly complicated Title IX and campus safety cases. Because of the nature of these cases, they're big. And so I've worked with teams of attorneys where I'm the lead attorney. I'm responsible for the paralegals, the staff, the attorneys working on those cases. So I have indeed managed them. I also am responsible for a staff of 35 people right now. I decide on hiring, firing, but budget increases, salaries, all the kinds of things that the Attorney General does. And the litigation division really, while they are employed by the Attorney General's office, they do the work of risk management. So I meet with them every Wednesday to work through a variety of cases. We talk through legal strategy, we talk through settlements, we talk through the kinds of work that the Attorney General's office does. And in addition, I work very closely with the executive team at the Attorney General's office to work on legislation, which is a really important part of what the Attorney General's office does, is they provide advice, support, and advocate for the kinds of bills that are going to support law enforcement, that are going to address issues regarding transparency in government, that are going to handle all kinds of issues that the Attorney General's office works on, and I've worked on those bills with them. And one thing I want to add to that is, one of the things that I bring to this office is an ability to bring a lot of different people together from a broad spectrum across the state. I have been working on the kinds of cases and the kinds of issues that require a lot of people and a lot of buy-in and support from a variety of different interests in order to come to a solution. And there are relationships that I have in cities, school districts, universities, but also with individuals across the state, because your voice as the citizens really matters so that we can solve these problems in our state.
This next question comes from Arnold in the Avenues. Most Utahns agree that DC overreach is out of control. As AG, how do you safeguard Utah's assets from federal government, including land, borders, and mineral assets? We'll start with you, Frank.
Absolutely. One of the things I've advocated since the beginning of this race is that there's a real problem that we keep begging and groveling before the federal government every time there's a Democrat in the White House to be able to use our land. That's a fundamental problem that I'm going to attack as soon as I get in. In fact, on June 26th, after I win the primary, I'm actually going to start meeting with legislators and say how to fix this problem. One of the things is we blew the opportunity in 2016. We had Trump in the White House and a Republican Congress, and nobody tried to deed the lands back to Utah. Mike Lee's got a little bit that he's trying, but he's trying like 1%. That's crazy. When Utah became a state and Nevada became a state, they deeded very, very little land to Utah and Nevada. Other states, they deeded huge amounts of land. And most of this land that the federal government owns is much more conducive for ranching, mining, and recreation. It is not like the Escalante that we think of. When we think of Escalante, for instance, that is a beautiful little area, but most of the Grand Staircase is actually hiding coal. And that's why there was this Grand Staircase designation to prevent the coal mining from happening. And so and I flew over those in an airplane, so I've actually seen these things. And right now, we're not being able to maintain roads that are existing. They're not letting the counties do that. They're also not letting law enforcement have the full authority to investigate and prosecute in every square inch of their county. That's one of the things I want to push back against the feds and say, you can't be doing this. We're going to start doing it. We're going to maintain the roads whether you like it or not. We're going to enforce the law whether you like it or not. But we need to have some statutes passed to be able to make that happen. I think you also mentioned there's other federal overreach. I'm really upset that the Department of Justice is trying to control our school districts. I'm going to make sure we kick them out. They're also trying to control our prisons and jails with respect to gender-confused inmates. My response back to them is to say, if they don't like the way we do it in Utah, don't send that federal inmate to Utah. They have other places they can go. So we have an obligation, I think, to protect Utah, to push back against this federal overreach, because it's huge. Last April 3rd, I think it was, I filed a brief in the U.S. Supreme Court doing just that, fighting against federal overreach in eastern Utah where they're trying to shut down a railroad that will transport waxy crude oil out of this state to benefit this state. So we are being robbed of the ability to fund things like education and law enforcement in the state because the federal government is holding all the cards and the strings. We need to change that. I will not stop until that is reversed.
Rachel?
So one of my top priorities is fighting federal overreach in education, in public lands, and in energy. Now, what the role of the Attorney General's office is in this fight is specifically litigation. And I'm going to give you some examples, very specific examples of how this would work. When it comes to education, there are Title IX changes the Biden administration administered that have completely changed the nature and meaning of Title IX. And so a lawsuit is appropriate there. When it comes to energy and public lands, one of the big issues is fighting what's called the Antiquities Act. This is what the President Clinton, then Obama, and now Biden have used to expand the monuments to make it difficult, if not impossible, to use a large swath of land in the state of Utah. So how do we address that? Well, we fight it in court. We need the Supreme Court to say that the way the Antiquities Act has been used to lock Utahns out of Utah land is unconstitutional, and that's a fight that I'm going to lead. When it comes to our energy production, it's impacted by things like the Endangered Species Act, which is being abused. It is things like the BLM, who's trying to strip away grazing permits in Garfield and Kane County, and that's a big deal because you don't really think, I live in Davis County, we don't really think about grazing permits impacting our daily life. But it's going to impact all of us. If they take away these permits, then we lose those ranches in rural Utah. When we lose those ranches, we lose the communities where they live and the schools and the cultural heritage that they've had for generations in Utah. And these are the things I'm willing to fight and want to continue to fight in federal court because that is my job to protect Utahns' resources.
I just want to say I agree. I agree with everything Rachel just said on that.
Okay. Good answer from the both of you. This next question is from Kylie in Taylorsville. Under Utah law, aggravated murder is the only crime subject to the death penalty. Would you support expanding this consequence to other crimes and other regions?
So I usually honestly take my moral thinking from the Bible and I read it every day. And in there, they talk about that there needs to be an intent to murder. And so I do not like it when they're trying to use the death penalty like on a 3 strikes and you're out, like I think they might have in Texas. You commit 3 certain felonies and somehow you're going to get the death penalty. I am a little bit concerned about that. I think you should be very careful anytime you're trying to impose the death penalty and somebody didn't intend to actually kill or harm somebody. I think that's the difference. If you're trying to harm them at all, it's fair game if they ended up dying. I agree with that. But there are sometimes situations where someone might be involved in a felony and they might not actually be intending to kill somebody and someone nonetheless might die during that felony. That's where I think we need to be a little bit more careful. However, I am for the death penalty. I'm also I actually am very favorable to the firing squad because I think it's the most humane way to execute somebody. I do think that the fact that you have the death penalty is part of my position of being pro-life, because if somebody takes someone's life, then it's respecting that person's life by forfeiting the person who took the life.
Rachel?
I do support the death penalty in limited circumstances. I don't think it'll be helpful to expand it beyond where it applies right now. It can be a useful tool that we use in prosecution of these kinds of crimes. But expanding it to other areas I don't think would be appropriate nor helpful because the application of the death penalty is really hard on the families and of the victims because it takes such a long time. I think there's a lot of reforms that we need to have there because it puts it not only elongates the process for the person on death row, but more importantly, the victims' families who have to go through hearing after hearing after hearing to get through this process. Now, that doesn't mean that we don't need more stringent punishments for things like child abuse. sexual assault and domestic violence, because making sure that the criminal justice system actually makes Utah safer is really important. And when you have someone who is engaged in violence against their partner and they're in and out of the booking process at prison, in jail, before the victim can even give her victim statement, we have a real problem and people don't feel safe.
Just want to reply a little bit to that and push back a little bit. I think it actually helps most of the victim families to have a death penalty where somebody died. And yes, does it take a while? Yes. But it's something that's really problematic for those victims to realize this person is still alive and they could somehow be released someday, or they could somehow victimize somebody else in some other way. And so I don't think that most of the victims in my experience actually support that idea.
Do you have a rebuttal?
Yeah, I just want to clarify. I'm not saying that that I don't want the death penalty because of its impact on the families. I'm saying the process for how it moves forward and how slowly, when you have somebody who's on death row for decades and the family has to go into multiple hearings for that person, that's problematic. I think the process needs to be streamlined so that it doesn't have such a prolonged impact on the families who were victimized by that crime.
Okay. This next question comes from Rob in South Salt Lake. What is your relationship between the current governor and between the party nominees candidates for governor? We'll start with you, Frank.
All right. First of all, I don't work for the governor. My opponent does work for the governor. The other candidate who used signatures, he actually is endorsed by the governor. I think this is important because I am truly independent. I do not have the Speaker of the House in the legislature. I don't have any legislature that I've gone to and said, I want your endorsement. One legislator actually endorsed me on his own without me asking for it. But I'll tell you that if you have a whole bunch of people up in state government, Congress people, you've got the governor, the lieutenant governor being on a campaign fundraising committee and things like that, you are compromised because you can't give truly independent judgment unless you are your own person. And nobody owns me. That's the benefit of my campaign, is that nobody owns me going in. I'm not owned by the state bureaucracy. I'm not owned by the legislature. I'm not owned by Congress.
Rachel?
So do you mind reading that question again? I want to make sure that I'm really trying to understand. Is it Rob? What Rob wants to ask
Rob
me?
from South Salt Lake asks, what is your relationship between the current governor and between the party nominee's candidate for governor?
Yeah, so my relationship to the current governor and to Phil Lyman. So, as Frank said, I was appointed by Governor Cox. That's how the Director of Risk Management works. My direct report is not the governor. It's a cabinet member, and we work closely together. He's the one who approves and works with me on the different projects that I'm on. But I have not endorsed anyone in the governor's race. And the reason is I wanted to be fair and appropriate considering my current position and making sure that whoever is governor, I am ready and willing to work with. Because even though I don't get to choose who's sitting at the table, I get to choose how I work with that person. And it's really important that the governor and the attorney general have a positive relationship. Now, also an independent relationship, because the most effective attorney general is someone who can give independent legal advice and move forward on legal issues without worrying about the political fallout from the legislature or the governor. And that's something I'm ready and willing to do.
I misunderstood that question. Can I just give a brief rebuttal then?
Go ahead.
Yeah. First of all, since it applies to the governor, again, I can work with anybody. I've had that in the past. I've worked with attorneys from the National Prison Project, from the ACLU, from Washington, D.C. I've worked with a number of very, I'd say, difficult people to work with over the years and have done that very successfully. So I can work with anyone who's governor. The problem I have with Governor Cox is that he vetoed the women's sports bill 2 years ago. There's no reason that should happen in Utah. I was thankful that the legislature overrode him. And so for that reason, I'm not endorsing anyone. I have not endorsed anyone, but I support Phil Lyman for governor because of that.
Our next question comes from Looks like Lori in Sandy. Attorney generals are not policymakers, but how much influence does the attorney general have when it comes to policy? And with this one, we'll start with Rachel. So Rachel, go ahead.
So the attorney general is the chief counsel for the state of Utah, not for the governor, not for the legislature. And so while I won't pass bills, I'll still have a lot of influence on the policies that we set for the state, because one of the ways you influence policy is the way you handle a lawsuit. Every single day when I'm working with the Attorney General's office as the Director of Risk Management on a variety of cases, we have to decide which cases we're going to push forward to trial, which ones we're going to settle, and which legal principles we're going to pursue, which ones we're going to let go, because we know that working on these cases sets precedent for the entire state. And so we're really careful and thoughtful. Another way as your Attorney General that I will influence policy is promoting and supporting legislation that will benefit the state, such as working on bills that support law enforcement or bills that apply to higher education, which are areas that are supported by the Attorney General's office. So the Attorney General has a tremendous amount of impact on the policy for the state of Utah.
Okay. Go ahead.
I would like to say that one is that there sometimes is a fine distinction between policy versus the law. And I was really troubled during COVID that we never heard anything from our Attorney General while rights were being taken away. We had a U.S. Supreme Court Justice Alito who toured the country during that time saying he'd never seen such a retraction of our civil liberties in his lifetime. There should have been somebody coming out. I can guarantee you that nobody called my competitors and said, hey, what about my rights? What can I do here and what can I do there? Can I get a religious exemption? People did call me and I helped them free of charge. I helped many people get religious exemptions to the vaccine. I would have done, if I'm Attorney General and our governor's not doing what he should do, I would do what DeSantis did. I would come out and say, you better not fire anybody for not getting the vaccine. You better not ask them whether they have the vaccine because HIPAA and other regulations prohibit you delving into medical reasons of employees and so on. And so you can call that policy. I call it telling people what their constitutional rights are. And so there's a number of areas like this that come up from time to time, sometimes with parental rights issues in school boards meetings, whether they have the right to free speech in those school board meetings. Those are the things where it's appropriate and right for the AG's office to actually weigh in on those things, because not only does the AG's office defend schools, the Attorney General is over all agency counsel in the state.
Do we have our caller, sir? Hey, Jacob.
Yeah.
Hey, you are live on Red Alert TV, and we are with the Attorney General candidates. Go ahead and give your question. Let them know exactly what the situation is, and we'll give them a chance to answer your question. Go ahead.
All right. So in foster care, there is a lot of trauma and misunderstood pain that could be involved with many different kinds of cases throughout the state. Sometimes that comes with a lot of other issues and behavior challenges when a child is involved with foster care. As a person who went through foster care myself, my question to you guys would be, how can we ensure that 100% of foster care children don't experience further trauma once placed in a permanent foster home? And would it be something advocated for in the future for the rehabilitation of children and proper compensation for those who were mistreated, neglected, abused, etc. by the foster care system? And how can we become more resilient in our efforts to protect parent rights?
You're first.
We'll start with Rachel.
So first of all, thank you for that question, Jacob. And I'm sorry about the negative experience that so many kids have in our foster care system and the continued trauma that they experience, first being separated from their parents and then the ongoing trauma that often happens in foster care. My role as Attorney General will be to support Child Protective Services and the other agencies that support the foster care system, and then in addition to that, making sure that we have the right support services through the Children's Justice Center, which serves to interview and help victims, child victims and witnesses of violence and trauma. And so my job will be to work through that. And I am committed to making sure that we protect the most vulnerable, which includes our children, and especially our children in the foster care system. That is something I would fight for and support, and would love to have someone like you who's been through the system advise me and help me know what your experiences have been and how the state could have and should have done differently.
Frank?
Yes, thank you, Jacob, for your question. I'm probably the only Attorney General candidate, probably since Paul Van Dam, when he was Attorney General, who's actually litigated a lot in this area. I've litigated a lot of cases in juvenile court, a lot of custody, a lot of abuse cases, and so on. I fought to get kids taken out of foster care when they were in terrible situations. So I feel for you, and I know exactly the kinds of things that happen sometimes where they're not treated right. They're given this basement room sometimes with no windows, and they're just, some of them are just making money on the deal. And there's got to be a better way of doing that. There needs to be training because sometimes those people that approve foster care license, they denied my client being foster care parents because they had a concealed weapons permit. They were fantastic parents. I had to get involved and fight to actually get their foster care license, and the state of Utah had to pay my attorney fees for vindicating that person's right. That's crazy. And there's other politically correct reasons nowadays that they're sometimes denying good people being foster care parents. So I know exactly what you're talking about, and that's one of the things. DCFS is another area that I've sued many times and won, and I will make sure, one, that there's better training so that these people are not using inappropriate criteria, and two, that there's safety and security in those homes, and that they're not being taken advantage of somehow, and three, that they're not put in those homes when they don't need to be. A lot of times, sometimes I've found DCFS actually squeezes people out who are next of kin because they don't tell them what their rights are. You've got to raise the next of kin within 6 months of the proceeding, and they kind of just move them along and until they've lost that next of kin placement. So there's many times where there could be actually some excellent placements other than foster care. And I'm very much committed to trying to revamp that system because there are a lot of problems with it.
Great question, Jacob. Thank you for the question.
Yep.
So we're down to our final two questions here on Red Alert. As Attorney General, do you ensure accountability for police actions? And would you require our boys in blue to make some changes in academy curriculum? And how would you approach de-escalation tactics? We'll start with Rachel.
Yes. So one thing that we can agree on is that the police are important to protecting all of us. Another thing I think we can agree on is that not everything our police does or do is helpful and appropriate. And so when you talk about making sure that we have the right training, that's really important. But it's also making sure that we identify and limit the amount of things that we're asking from our law enforcement officers. Often we're asking them to be social workers and caregivers and so many other things, and mental health providers, when we really just need them to be police officers. But giving them the tools, especially in de-escalation, giving them the tools to know how better to work within minority populations, giving them the tools, knowing how to deal with people who are obviously having a mental break, and more importantly, people who are not obviously having a mental break, so that we don't escalate and we don't hurt people who are seeking help from our law enforcement officer. Now, the other thing is making sure that as the Attorney General, I don't oversee and regulate every law enforcement officer in the state of Utah. That's not my job. However, I want to provide support to those agencies that do, because POST, the Department of Corrections, Department of Public Safety, those are supported by the Attorney General's office, and I will give them the support that they need to do what they need to do to provide well-trained and well-prepared law enforcement officers, and when appropriate, to assist in prosecution of law enforcement officers who go beyond the law. I'm so grateful to be supported by law enforcement officers on the front lines, the Fraternal Order of Police, in addition to county attorneys and sheriffs across the state, who I believe are also committed to making sure that we make these changes to increase trust and transparency communication between our law enforcement and our communities.
Frank?
Yeah, I have by far more sheriffs and county attorneys that are actually endorsed my campaign for attorney general. It's the ones that I've worked with, and they've actually seen my work. And that's significant because I don't think most of the endorsements of any of the other candidates have actually seen their legal work. They've never seen them in court. They really have no idea of what they're capable of. But I will also say this: I believe I'm also the only candidate that's actually taught at peace officer standards and training. I've also helped to keep people's license in check when it should be, and I've also helped to actually have it removed when they needed to have their post certification removed. I've done that side of it as well, and appeared before the post council on many occasions. I'm also the only candidate in this race that teaches law enforcement issues on a regular basis. Every year I teach at the Utah Sheriff's Association conference. I've taught at the Utah Prosecution Conference as well, and I've actually taught corrections law at the University of Utah. But one of the things that you need to know is there's a difference between police and sheriffs. So most of the sheriffs do support me. I don't really deal with many police. Robbie Russo, Chief of Police of Cottonwood Heights, has endorsed me because I do work for him, and he sees the work, and he sought me out because he saw the quality of me defending officers. I've defended use of force cases. I've also sued Salt Lake City PD when their officers were out of control, and they had to cough up a lot of money to my client when they violated her Fourth Amendment rights. So there is both sides of this that needs to be looked at. Sometimes police do overstep, and they need to be kept in check. I'm the kind of attorney that actually does this kind of training on an ongoing basis. And so I know exactly the kind of training you're talking about and what you need. Now, when it's a police officer, it's the mayor who's in charge of those police officers. It is not the county. It is not the state. And that's something that people need to realize all across the country. Every time you see these racist cities like St. Louis and Minneapolis and Baltimore, they need to start calling into question the Democratic mayors that are running these supposed racist police forces. Because I can tell you there's excellent training that we're doing here in Utah, and I'm actively involved in that training. I've seen that it works. But are there problems sometimes? Yes. And it needs to be owned when there's problems. But most of the time, they actually do an excellent job. And I am respected by a lot of sheriffs in the state and a lot of county attorneys because I will speak the truth to them. If we screwed up, I tell them that. If we didn't, we fight it all the way to a jury trial and win.
For this last segment here on the Face Off with Red Alert, we'd like you guys to look into those cameras, directly into the viewers. And I want to start with Rachel.
Okay.
Go ahead and tell the viewers that are watching why this primary is important and why you should be the Attorney General candidate coming out of the Republican Party.
Thank you.
Go ahead.
Well, the Attorney General's race really does matter. In many ways, the Attorney General is more significant to your daily life than the governor, than the senator, than a congressman, than almost anyone else in the state, because my job is to protect your rights and to support and defend Utahns and the state of Utah, to protect our resources. And so the work that I will do as your Attorney General really matters to your daily life. As I've spent the last 6 months talking to people across the state, the message that I've received the most is that what people are looking for is an Attorney General who will be independent, who will fight for them, and is someone that they can trust. You can tell what a person's future behavior is going to be by looking at their past conduct. And I am someone who has been fighting the fights, been in the trenches for a long time. As I mentioned, both as a litigator and now as someone who runs a state agency who has experience in all the areas that you need an effective Attorney General. I'm independent because I am someone who believes in the space between the governor and the legislature, and I will maintain that. I will be accessible, transparent, and available to you. Like right now, if you were to call my phone, which is on my website, I'm going to answer you. You send me an email, I'm going to answer you because that's what you deserve. You deserve an Attorney General who will be responsive to you. And I am so honored to be supported by the people who are in the trenches of the work of the Attorney General's office, both leaders within the office and attorneys, and importantly, the law enforcement officers across the state, the thousands of law enforcement enforcement officers in the Fraternal Order of Police, in addition to county attorneys and sheriffs. I love advocating for the state of Utah. It's what I'm good at. It's what I want to keep doing for the rest of my career, is supporting you, is defending you. And I will always remember that you are my client, and I will focus on the work and nothing else.
Frank?
Yes, and I'll say that it's excellent that Rachel has worked in the Attorney General's office. That's very important. And we can quibble back whether I had a bigger case than she did. I've had any class action suits. You can quibble about these different things. You can quibble about endorsements. I have the Veterans GOP. I have American Moms. I have Eagle Forum. I have Western Liberty. There's a lot of people that support me. But I like what thing she said. Look at their past, because I am the only candidate in this race who has fought day in and day out for people's constitutional rights on nearly any issue you want to talk about. And we talk about the pro-life issues. Sure, everyone's going to say they're pro-life. Well, what have they done about it? Not only have I vindicated and fought for these things in the courts at the appellate level as well as the trial level, I also help Pregnancies Resource Center, Pro-Life Utah. They call me all the time. In fact, as a practical matter, people call me all the time about constitutional issues. Someone just called me yesterday about a constitutional issue. I get these calls all the time, and I take them. I'm going to have somebody in charge of taking calls, and I'm going to actually go live on radio and TV to have an Ask the Attorney General program where people can ask any legal issue that they want that's on their mind. I got this from when I worked in Milwaukee one year when I was in law school, and there was a guy named Ask Alan Eisenberg that was an attorney. And I said, this is a great thing because people need this. People call me all the time. That's the kind of person I am. And you know it not just because I'm saying it, it's because actions speak louder than words. Look at the actions of fighting in the trenches. Are they fighting for constitutional rights for real people like the ones that are listening out there, or are they just platitudes? If you want real action and somebody that's really going to fight for your rights, then you've got to hire an attorney general like me who's been doing it for the last several decades. Thank you, and please vote for Frank Mylar for Attorney General on June 25th.
And with that, red alert, this was Face Off with Rachel Terry, Frank Mylar. We'll see you at the primary. Have a good night.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good job, you guys.